From a well-known story of a ghostly hitchhiker which quite frankly reeks of urban legend, to a chilling tale of one man's struggle to live with a malevolent force, here are 5 ghost stories from the City of London. Number 19. St. James's Place in the St. James's district was once the home of 2 sisters, Anne and Harriet Pearson. Having spent most of their lives together, the pair became inseparable and were devoted to one another. Anne Pearson died in 1858 and her sister lived on in the house alone for the next 6 years. In November of 1864, while Harriet was visiting Brighton 54 miles away on the southeast coast, she became unwell and demanded to be returned home. She was rushed back to London and there she was cared for by her housekeeper Eliza Quinton and 2 of her nieces, Miss Coppinger and Miss Emma Pearson. Also in the house, watching over Harriet for the next few weeks, was her nephew's wife, Mrs. Pearson. On the night of December 23rd, Miss Coppinger and Emma Pearson went to bed, leaving Mrs. Pearson to watch over the now gravely ill Harriet. The 2 women, whose room was opposite, left their door open and candles burning in the hallway in case they were called during the night. At around 1 a.m., both women were roused from their sleep when they turned to face the open doorway and looked out into the candlelit hall. They saw the figure of a woman wearing a shawl and a black cap walk past their room and into the bedroom across the hall where Harriet lay. Moments later, in a fit of fear, Mrs. Pearson ran out of Harriet's bedroom. The 3 women congregated and all said that they had recognized the apparition as the late Anne Pearson and agreed it was likely that she had come for her dying sister. They then woke the housekeeper and told her what they had seen. Miss Harriet Pearson died 5 hours later at 6 a.m. on December 24, 1864. Before she died, she told the 4 women who had cared for her in the last weeks of her life that she too had seen her sister that same night. This next story concerns British author and broadcaster James Wentworth Day. He was probably best known for his literary works on English farming, country affairs, motorsports and his years as editor of the long-running Country Life magazine. But he was also a paranormal investigator and wrote numerous books about his experiences and methods. Born in Exning in Suffolk on England's southeast coast, he spent many years in London. It was here in the mid-1930s that he leased an apartment on King Street in Hammersmith. While working in the city, this large high-ceilinged 17th-century building had a pine-paneled entrance hall and a black and white tiled floor. The large first-floor living room, according to Day, was full of sunshine and grace and he felt content and full of optimism when he first walked into his new vocational home. But he would later make the statement, "I have leased a curse." Eager to explore, he bound up the stairs to the 2nd floor, into the 2 rooms that would be his living space. But once inside the 2nd-floor living room, he felt an overwhelming feeling of dread, a feeling that emanated from the far left corner of the room. In that corner there was a small fireplace and next to it a door which led into a dressing room. He said that he felt something was staring at him from the corner, an unseen presence that was full of hatred and pain. He stared back, attempting to prove himself wrong and shake the uneasy feeling, but it remained. During the first 2 weeks of his stay, his strained marriage fell apart and they moved out, unable to face living there whilst dealing with his loss. Eventually, though for reasons unknown, he did return. His once temporary lease was made permanent and he remained there for the next 2 years. Over that time, James Wentworth Day said that he rarely had a good night's sleep. He suffered emotionally, physically and financially, and when he returned home at the end of the day, he rarely found solace. Something was always there, he felt, watching him from the dark corner of that room. Then his home was burgled and he lost every valuable item he had, mostly family heirlooms. None of them were recovered and they were not insured. Soon after this, the china shop, which now occupied the ground floor, went bankrupt and closed down. The wine business that took over the shop soon suffered the same fate. James Wentworth Day's brother, sister, godson and goddaughter visited him from Ireland for a while. He had hoped that their presence would raise his spirits and maybe even drive out the evil presence. For a time he admits things did improve and the malevolent force disappeared. That is, until one evening when Day returned home late. His family were out on a hunting trip and weren't due to return until the next day. He was expecting to be alone. When he entered his living room and turned on the light, he again became conscious of that evil something. This time it felt stronger and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. At that point he heard a loud, piercing scream from the top floor. It was his goddaughter. He rushed to her aid and when he entered the bedroom she was sat on the bed, clutching the bed sheets close to her face and sobbing uncontrollably. The 19-year-old explained that she had returned home early and gone into the 2nd-floor living room. She said that she had seen something by the fireplace, something black staring at her from the corner of the room, something tied up. The next morning Day's family returned and prepared to go back to Ireland. He explained what had happened. They all agreed that something was very wrong with the place and attributed it to all the bad luck he had been having. "Even you are beginning to look haunted," his sister said. For James Wentworth Day, this was the last straw. He finally gave up his lease, something he admitted he should have done a long time ago. He lost money for cutting the lease short, but that didn't bother him. He was glad to see the back of the place. Some years later he was visited by a friend from Canada. Keen to show his friend the city and relay some historical anecdotes, he took his companion to his old haunt, King Street. As they walked together, they passed an old man who they recognized as a former butler to one of the houses in the neighborhood. He greeted him, introduced his friend, and asked the old man to tell them a historical tale from Old King Street. Happy to oblige, the old fellow walked with them for some time, telling stories of the buildings that lined the street and the people who had lived there over the years. As they approached the house that James Day used to live in, the old man stopped, pointed his walking stick towards the house and said that building there is the unluckiest house in the whole of London. It has brought nothing but bad luck to whoever has lived there. In actual fact, it is haunted. It was then that he told a tale of the house that James Wentworth Day had never heard before. He explained that 200 years ago, when the house was still relatively young, a man lived there with his personal servant. The specific details of what occurred in that house, the old man admitted, were not fully known, but what is known is that one day the occupants disappeared from the neighborhood without a trace, leaving no clue as to where they had gone. After a while the matter was investigated, and on the second-floor living room the decomposing body of the servant was found. He had been garroted with a rope and tied to a chair. His eyes bulged from their sockets and his now swollen black tongue hung grotesquely from his mouth. The head of the household was never traced and the person or persons responsible were never found. That dead man, the old-timer went on, still sits in the corner of that room to this day. He said that many people have felt an evil or tortured presence in that room, and some have on occasion even reported seeing a black apparition lurking in the corner. He explained that he'd seen people come and go from that house for the last 50 years, and no one, even those who hadn't reported anything sinister, ever prospered during their time there. It is truly cursed. A year after this chance meeting on King Street, World War II broke out and the bombs began to fall on London. During the Blitz, the old cursed building was lost. The area has since been rebuilt and today an unremarkable modern building stands in its place. London's Heathrow Airport began life in 1929 as a small airfield known as the Great Western Aerodrome. Then in 1944 an expansion operation began. The new expansion was intended to cater for military planes during World War II, but by the time it was complete, the war had ended. However, new plans for a civil airport took over and the expansion continued. In 1946, it was eventually reopened as London Airport, but barely 2 years into its new life, the airport experienced a tragedy. At around 9:15 p.m. on the night of March 2, 1948, a Douglas DC-3 plane operated by Sabena Airlines of Belgium crashed in foggy conditions. All 3 crew members and 17 of the 19 passengers died. It was the first major air disaster to take place at the airport. The story goes that during the cleanup operation, a well-dressed man stepped out of the fog and approached the rescue team. Told them that he was looking for a briefcase which had been lost in the crash. When he was told by the confused staff to inquire after the cleanup was over, he disappeared back into the fog. It has been said that soon after this, the same man's corpse was found amongst the plane's wreckage. In 1970, a police inspector named Leslie Alton received a report that the tower's radar had spotted a person walking along one of the runways. Inspector Alton, who had worked at the airport for 20 years, rushed to the runway along with his team. On arrival, he radioed back to the tower. They told him that he should be able to see the person because as far as they could see, he or she was stood right next to him. When Alton replied that he could see no one, the tower confirmed that the person was directly behind him, adding that his squad car was close to running them over. For some time, the mystery person continued to show up on the airport's radar. But try as he might, Leslie Alton found no one in the vicinity. The search was eventually called off. Although most say that the man or apparition hasn't been seen for many years, in 2014, prior to the airing of Sebastian Bakiewicz's BBC radio play entitled Ghosts of Heathrow, one airport employee who didn't give his name spoke to the station and said that he'd worked at the airport for 29 years. He claimed that there were as many as 7 reports of the mystery man during his time at the airport by various pilots who truly believed that they had seen a man walking along the runway as they came into land. I've worked here, yeah, I've done 29 years here on BA and I drive the pilots around, I do the passengers as well, but I drive the pilots around, the crews, and they've actually told me about 6-7 pilots have actually told me they've seen a man in a black suit, bowler hat, umbrella and a briefcase walking down this new runway. So they've said to me they think they've run someone over in their plane and they've actually asked for the master section to come out and check the runway. Why would they call the tower? Because the tower is saying to them, well, there's nothing on their radar. And the pilot is saying, well, I'm telling you, I've just run someone over. It's unknown, of course, if this was the same apparition or if it was a ghost at all. There is the glaring difference between Neve's alleged recent sightings and the 1970s sighting, that being that the radar tower in 1970 reported seeing the figure, but the men on the ground did not. The airport worker speaking in the clip I just played says the opposite. After reading some of the reports made immediately after the 1948 crash, I found out that the plane's wreckage had burst into flames and had been incinerated along with the dead, leaving them unrecognizable. So the part of the story which states the corpse of a mystery man who was seen following the crash had been found amongst the plane's wreckage is doubtful. It's likely that the 1948 disaster, coupled with the dramatic story of a mystery man stepping out of the fog on a dark night looking for a briefcase, may well have been used as a convenient backstory to add credence to the sighting of an alleged ghost. But the fact remains that there are accounts of a specter having been seen on Heathrow's runways. If it wasn't the restless remnants of a 1948 crash victim, then who or what was it? The Blackwall Tunnel consists of two tunnels that run beneath the River Thames, the first of which, and the one which features in this story, was completed in 1897 after the city saw a growing need for traffic to flow more freely across the Thames from south to north. It saw its fair share of tragedy during its construction and inevitably during its time in service. This case, probably the most well-known on the list, concerns a motorcyclist who, in October of 1972, picked up a young male hitchhiker in Greenwich near the entrance of the original northbound tunnel. The story goes that the young man gave his Essex address to the motorcyclist before they began their journey. Once through the tunnel, the motorcyclist turned back to speak to the passenger, but he was gone, convinced that he had fallen from the vehicle somewhere in the tunnel. Although one might think the rider would have felt a sudden jolt or lightness of the vehicle if he had, he rode back to find him. The rider made the journey back and forth twice before giving up the search. There was no frantic commotion in the tunnel as he'd expected, and no one lay in the road. There was no sign of the young man at all. It was as if he had never been there, thinking that his fallen passenger may have found his way home by other means. He rode to the house in Essex the next day to find out what had happened. When he arrived, he was told by the occupants of the home that the young man had died years earlier. It's unknown who the motorcyclist spoke to or what their relationship was with the young man, or even if the scene of his death was the Blackwall Tunnel, which makes this tale frustratingly vague but creepy nonetheless. There are a few variations of this story depending on where you read it. Some say the passenger was not a young man but a young woman. Some say they were hitchhiking near the entrance to the tunnel, while others say they thumbed a ride inside the tunnel itself. When author Peter Underwood wrote about the story in 1975, he gave no mention of how the phantom passenger died, while many other retellings claim that it was the ghost of another biker who had died in a road accident years before. This particular part of the story probably originates from an event that apparently happened in 1960, but the link wasn't brought to public attention until more than 3 decades later. It occurred in 1960 at Blackwall Lane, which is little less than a mile south of the Blackwall Tunnel entrance. This account was taken from a letter to the Fertion Times. It was sent by Mr. Roy Dent and featured in a 1994 issue of the magazine. Roy Dent, who was from Harrow, states in the letter that he and his wife were living at his father-in-law's house at the time. He wrote that late one rainy evening they were all sat in the front room when they heard a sudden screech of tires followed by a loud crash. When Mr. Dent's father-in-law went out to investigate, he found the remnants of an accident. A motorcyclist had skidded in the rain, hit a curb and was thrown into a road sign, which killed him instantly. A few nights later Mr. and Mrs. Dent were woken at around 2 a.m. for what he described as an identical sequence of sounds. When they went to investigate, the usually busy RD, even at that hour, was empty and quiet. This story, according to newspaper reports, was taken very seriously at the time because it, and I quote, involved people of the highest social position. It allegedly occurred one December evening in 1913. A vicar of a Kensington church had just finished overseeing the evening's choir practice, and as he walked down the aisle on his way out of the building, a distressed-looking woman stepped out of the pews. She approached him and told him that a gentleman she knew had requested his presence immediately, and that he needed to accompany her to a house nearby. "A gentleman is dying there," she said. "He is extremely concerned about the state of his soul and is anxious to see you before he dies." After a short conversation, the vicar agreed and accompanied the woman to the nearby home in a cab. On arrival they rang the doorbell and a butler answered. The vicar explained that he was there to see a gravely ill man who had requested his presence. Looking shocked, the butler said that he must be mistaken. There was no one in the house who was unwell. The vicar explained that the lady had told him that the owner of the house, whose name was not given, requested to see him as a matter of urgency. When the vicar turned to the woman for confirmation, she was gone. He found himself looking down an empty pathway leading to a quiet, dark RD. There was no sign of her or the taxicab. The butler, now concerned, looked at the vicar as if he was a practical joker. But then the owner of the house stepped out of an adjoining room and asked the man what he wanted. He said, "I have been told that you wanted to see me urgently and that you are seriously ill." The owner of the house then asked who had given this information. The vicar gave a description of the woman. The man said he had no such friend or acquaintance, but seeing as he was here, he should come in and talk about another matter. Both men entered the living room and the owner of the house explained that although he was feeling well, he admitted that he had been planning on contacting the vicar on another matter. "Now that you are here, let us brush aside this strange incident. If you will give me the time, we will discuss what has been on my conscience. I have been troubled lately about the state of my soul." The vicar stayed for an hour and it was arranged that his new acquaintance should come to the church after service the next morning to discuss the matter further. The next morning, however, the man did not show up. Now concerned about his well-being, the vicar returned to the house. He was greeted at the door by the butler, who explained that his master had died the night before, shortly after he had left. He then showed him to the bedroom upstairs where the dead man lay. On a table in the middle of the room was a photograph of the same woman who had begged the clergyman to follow her the night before. "Who is that?" the vicar asked. "That, sir, is my master's wife who died 15 years ago.